This is Tabletop Babble, and I'm Amber. Hello! Today on the show, I had a lovely chat with game designer and visual artist Caro Asercion. We sat down on May 10th and talked about getting into TTRPGs via actual play podcasts, finding design prompts on Tumblr, Tumblr, game jams on Itch, environmental storytelling, and Caro's games like, I'm sorry, did you say Street Magic? Hi, Caro, and welcome to Tabletop Babble. For my listeners, would you please introduce yourself, your pronouns, and what you do in this space?
Yeah, hi, thank you for having me on, Amber. My name is Caro Asercion. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm a designer predominantly. I do some visual art, and just a general hobbyist enthusiast in the tabletop space is how I would describe myself.
Yeah, I feel like more and more as I speak with people doing the show, everybody does like 3 to 4 things. they have a collection of things that they do, which is very cool and very interesting. So when I have people on the show, I really like to know like kind of how you got started in the TTRPG space. Like, were you like, how did that happen? Did you start playing first? Very rarely, I think people start designing first before playing games, but I don't know, that could happen. But for you specifically, how did you get started?
I guess this takes me all the way back to high school, however many years ago. I grew up with, like, you know, a very pop cultural kind of surface understanding of what TTRPGs are, as far as, like, oh, you know, the Dungeons and Dragons episode of your cartoons or your TV shows, like, the very kind of surface presentation. So I always kind of had an understanding of, like, oh, this is the idea of what tabletop games are and kind of the pop culture milieu. And from that, I sort of was like, okay, this seems like, you know, I'm kind of a nerd. This seems like something I should know at least a little bit about. So in high school, a couple of my friends were more into, like, the D&D space predominantly. And I tried to get into it with them. I was like, oh, I'll join this campaign or show up for a one-shot or something. And I never really clicked. I think it just took me a while, and part of it was, you know, I had a bunch of other commitments at the time, and I just couldn't make the time to commit to a regular kind of ongoing campaign. And then, you know, I went to college and was like, oh, maybe I'll have more free time. And then that also didn't really happen. I joined a campaign that was also, again, D&D, and it lasted for, I think, I was able to make it to all of 1.5 sessions before I was like, this just doesn't work with my schedule. But the thing that really kind of pulled me back in, I was like, oh, maybe I have a space and a presence in this space, was actual play podcasts. I tended to put those on while I was studying or doing chores or whatever. I was just sort of like, oh, I don't have the time to commit to actually playing these games firsthand, but I can listen to somebody else who's playing these games and from there be like, okay, I'm gonna appreciate and also learn non-D&D systems. Like, a lot of the podcasts that I listened to were not D&D, and I was like, oh, I can use this as an opportunity to learn and to a degree familiarize myself with these other games that other folks are playing. And from there, I just sort of kind of kept leaning into that a little bit more. I really just sort of fell down the podcast rabbit hole. And then after I graduated college, I was like, I feel like I've listened to enough of these things that I might as well just sort of try making something myself. This was right around the time that, like, the itch.io boom was kind of kicking up. I think at the time, as I was listening to these podcasts, I was like, oh, these games are all really cool. They're certainly less complicated than D&D, but they're still a little bit, you know, kind of complex. They have a bunch of different moving pieces. They have a bunch of these things that are like, okay, I don't think I can really try to craft something myself. And then I went to itch.io and I was like, oh, some of these games are just 2 pages. Some of these games are super simple. Like I could just make a hack of something that's already here. And by that time I'd started to ease back into playing games. Like ran a campaign for my friends that was like very short and was like, okay, I feel like I'm getting a handle on some of the mechanics of these systems. And certainly between trying to play around with them myself and listening to these other podcasts, I was like, I feel like I can give this a shot and try and design something and see what happened. And it sort of fell into a hole and never really managed to pull myself out.
You're still in that hole today. So listening to all of that, I find it very interesting about like basically college. You can't really play because time commitments and stuff, but you end up just inundating yourself with actual play. So I want to know, how did you find out about like actual plays in general?
That's the question. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which ones were like the very, very first ones I listened to. The one that rises to the surface for me is Friends at the Table. I don't think it was the first one that I listened to, but it was certainly one of the ones that made the strongest impression as far as, okay, this is teaching a bunch of different, like, not teaching, but, you know, playing a bunch of different systems, introducing a whole bunch of just different ways to approach storytelling that are not one-shot based, but, you know, also just building out a longer, like, long-form arc. I listened to some episodes of the One Shot podcast, and it's like, okay, this is about a bunch of different, rapidly, just very easily, like, digestible episodes. So I think I can't even remember where I first started listening to podcast. Like, I don't have off the top of my head, like, oh, this was, like, the one link that somebody sent me, and I was like, oh, that's the thing that's gonna pull me in. Again, I felt like I kind of was just running in spaces that were adjacent to the tabletop scene enough that it sort of started rubbing off just by osmosis. I was like, okay, and somewhere along the way I must have just stumbled across a link and been like, okay, I'll listen to these shows and yeah, kind of sink into it from there.
Those podcasts, because I know Friends at the Table, they do basically like anthology kind of style where it's one season is a game, I think, and then of course One Shot Pod is like literally one shot after one shot. And so I'm kind of interested in your thoughts or feelings behind, as you were starting to discover, like, you had a limited experience with playing D&D, comparing what you were hearing in podcasts versus what you were hearing from your experiences or what you experienced playing D&D. What was your thought process behind that? Like, do you know what I'm getting at? I don't know if there's a question per se, but it's kind of like interesting because I know for me, maybe to help give some context to this train of thought I'm barreling down, is that when I first started playing D&D, it felt like it was the only thing available to me. And once you get high level in D&D, it starts to become, 2-hour battles.
It's just a completely different game.
Yeah. And I like parts of that. But then when I started getting exposed to actual plays that had one shots, like for me, it was like She's a Super Geek was a huge one for me. I was like, whoa, games can be not combat.
Yeah.
So what was your kind of mind-opening, mind-blossoming as you were experiencing this?
Definitely. I think for me, the thing that really jumped out was, I think it was like just realizing, oh, a game doesn't have to be a commitment. Like, you don't have to show up for 5 hours every week and bring, snacks and hole up in somebody's basement and like that, the stereotypical image of what D&D is. Like, that doesn't have to be it. A game can be something where you just sit down with 3 friends and shuffle a deck of cards and there's a list of questions inside and you flip them over and like an hour and a half later the game's done. Like, that can be so much simpler. in having this conversation, I'm realizing one of the other sparks, one of the other things that kind of introduced me to tabletop games was back in when I was on Tumblr. Actually, I'm still on Tumblr occasionally. Like, I still go on occasionally. But back in the heyday of when I was using it regularly, there was this blog that I followed and eventually ended up becoming like a contributor to, that was called Offbeat Classes in Tabletop Gaming. And it was basically like, okay, this person had my friend who created it basically had like a dictionary of just a whole bunch of random nouns and then tabletop classes, and would just shuffle those things together and get weird combinations like, okay, a bread bard. What is a bread bard? Like, what kind of powers or what kind of abilities or what would that character have? Or, you know, a candle wizard. Like, what makes a candle wizard different from a regular wizard? And we would, you know, go on these tangents of just like, okay, we're gonna come up with these, you know, fictionalized like skill trees or abilities or things that these characters would have. And I think this is the first non-D&D game that I was introduced to, was because the main kind of person who ran that blog, he was like, I'm gonna take a bunch of these and I'm gonna create classes for this game. And I apologize because the game has a swear in its title. It's called Big Motherfucking Crab Truckers. It's a game where you are these crabs who are large and drive a truck, and that's the premise. And it's just like a one-page RPG.
I love that kind of stuff. I think there's something so fun and magical about just randomly throwing things together and then trying to build something out of it.
Yeah.
So fun.
Mm-hmm. And, like, I think, honestly, that kind of idea of you're just going to have, like, a list of 1,000 nouns or whatever, and a list of classes, and just kind of mash those together and see what happens, isn't, like, the central ethos of like all of the design work that I've done since, but it certainly informed it in terms of just taking something from column A and taking something from column B and mashing them together and seeing kind of what happens.
Yeah, I love it. I think there's got to be a psychological phenomenon where you surprise yourself and it's delightful, and something so random as having a list of 1,000 nouns with 1,000 adjectives or something. It's like, why? There's so many games that if you have a random generator, I love random tables. I think it's especially for prep, like if you're a GM and you're prepping stuff, it's just so much. It's just fun. I don't know how else to say it. It's just fun.
Yeah.
So then going into that, you got your APs. You're starting to you had your Tumblr, which I still have mine as well. I can't bring myself to get rid of it because I put years of work into curating that thing.
You just spend so much time, and it's like there's something that is hard to delete about, you know, an archive of your formative teen years or whatever.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time doing aesthetic blogging. And so I like to look at it and be like, oh, calm when I look at all my pastels. But anyway, sorry. Tumblr tangent. But AP's Tumblr experience, and then, you know, you said getting into indies and running them for your friends after the fact, after college. When did the designing start for you? Yeah,
I think that was really in connection with the kind of itch boom is what I, you know, like to call it. Right around the time that I was after I graduated, I was continuing to listen to podcasts. This was when I was like trying to get more into Discord and, like, you know, more online social spaces that were also had tabletop folks. I was like, okay, I'm gonna follow some of these designers on Twitter because I don't really know what I'm doing with my life. You know, I'm fresh out of college. I'm gonna, you know, just sort of find some of these folks who are I was young and impressionable. And from there, I think especially just meeting folks who were like from following folks who were published and were kind of already well versed in the scene, that sort of opened up opportunities to meet folks who were emerging in the scene. Like, I think, in some of the folks who I were following were veterans, or were folks who have already had a couple of games under their belt, but, from the work that they were interested in, from the things that they were excited about, I was like, oh, I can, from here, see that this is a person who, they're going to retweet something by a person who maybe has less followers, and from there I can be like, okay, this person is doing something that's a little bit more underground. I'm going to see what they're up to, and then see what they're retweeting and who they're following, and kind of from there just sort of follow the conversation downward. Not downward in a pejorative sense, or just in terms of like getting into the grassroots stuff, like, who is inspiring who, and where is that happening at like the base level of kind of really getting into things that are experimental and indie in that space. So that was kind of where I started to meet some of those other designers, and then from there I was like, well, if you're making a game that is 2 pages and just uses a deck of cards, or something that's super super digestible, like a Forged in the Dark hack, who's to stop me from doing that?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many layers. Like, before starting this, or before I started in the space as well, it was one of those, like, as soon as you meet one person who's like, oh, your game is pretty cool, you can then see who, like you said, who they're interacting with. And it's like, oh, cool, I see this other. And then pretty soon, it's just like this whole group of people where they're making these really cool, like you said, experimental games, which is fascinating to me. Like, there is so much out there. And I think Itch is really a huge accessibility tool for all these people making games and stuff. So with Itch, I'm on your Itch page right now. And I'm excited because I went to the very first game, and we were talking about the mashup of two things. Squeak Easy.
Oh, yeah.
A game about rodents who are also run runners. This speaks to me so much. Like, I'm gonna buy it after the show, after we're done, because I love that kind of stuff. And it says that you did it for a game jam.
Yeah.
Can you, one, if you wouldn't mind, just to kind of like explaining maybe what that is to someone who's listening who might not know what that is, and then is this where you started to get, like, participating in game jams to get your games out there?
Yeah. I guess how I'll start is by saying, yeah, the idea of game jams is something I think is really foundational to, like, Itch as a platform, not just for tabletop games, but also for web games and other online games. One of the things that I think they do really well is these jams, which are kind of a community event where anybody can host a jam and say, hey, I'm going to create a prompt, or, that can be something that's mechanical, or it can be something that's fictional. Like, you could say, I'm going to run a jam that's about, wizards is the theme, and everybody who contributes is going to make a game about wizards. Or it could be a jam about, okay, I'm going to make a jam where you have to use, or you can't use dice. Like, this is a no dice jam. And all of the tabletop games, like, you're creating a tabletop game, but you're not allowed to use dice. So it's a space for people to come in and just have some sort of constraint. I think, especially when I was starting to design, one of the things that I faced was paralysis of just like, okay, there are so many games out here. There are so many things I could choose to make a game about. I just need something to push back against. And with that particular game jam, the prompt was riffing off of Grant Howitt's Honey Heist, which is like, okay, we're going to just make a jam that is about games about animals doing crimes. And I was like, okay, I can make a game about animals and crimes. Sure, why not? And this was, yeah, I was still very much finding my footing in the itch space. So I was like, I'm going to look at, join as many of these jams as I can. Just experiment. Just really throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And, like, try to dive in and do as many different kind of small, really scrappy experimental things as I can. And ultimately, like, a lot of those games are ones that, looking back on them, I'm like, I did this in 2 weeks. I could certainly go back and polish it up. Like, it's... I won't say I'm not proud of the work that I've done, but it's certainly something that, if I went back and knew then what I know now, I would certainly approach some of my work differently. But I'm pleased with the work that's kind of gone into that, certainly.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving us, like, if you can, off the top of your head, I'm bad at this too, like, remember what you made and tell us about it. I'm like, oh, geez, what? But if you can, like, can you walk us through some of, like, the kinds of games you've made?
Yeah, let me just pull up my itch page for a second. So, yeah, for a number of these games, I dabble in, like, a handful of different themes, but like, the very first game I made was called Alone in the Station Remnants. It's a hack of Alone Among the Stars, written by Takamo Okada, and that was written for the big kind of itch jam that sparked a lot of tabletop games, which was Sad Mech Jam, which is like the prompt was, make a game that is about mechs, but it's not about the fighting component. It's about, like, the emotions that are present in the mecha genre. So I was like, I'm gonna make a game about looking through, going through an abandoned space station and thinking about the memories of the place that you once lived, and thinking about, your relationship to this space and kind of your relationship and kind of your history in a place that you once lived and are no longer kind of a part of. And I think that, idea of place and connection to space is something that is pervasive in a lot of my games. Like, I ended up writing a sequel to Alone in the Station Remnants, which is actually, it's more of a conversational game, so it's pulling on similar themes, but instead of being about exploring a place, it's about you're trying to reconstruct a conversation log between these two pilots and kind of looking at a fragmented history from that angle. So, I don't know, sci-fi is a space that I'm certainly interested in, but I'm also really interested in this theme of place and kind of what people's, like, personal connection to places they've lived, places they've visited, how people connect to just physical space in that way, which I think is probably most present in my game. I'm sorry, did you say Street Magic?
So I love that kind of theme in general, because, we are, as human beings, mortal and we leave our spaces, right? And what we leave behind can tell a story. And I think it's almost like archaeology, right? Like, going back in, like, I think your sequel, Alone in the Station Remnants, and the Adrift in the Station Revenants, I love the idea of reconstructing logs and trying to make the story. Because I think, and I'm talking about me a lot, but I feel like this is something that you enjoy too, is that whole, you don't get the whole picture, but you as a person looking in kind of get to have, the fun is, like, wondering.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the one thing that I believe very strongly in is, there is no, objectivity. You kind of throw it out the window. Like, there's no one person who has a definitive perspective on any one thing. Like, you can't, look at what two sides of a conversation, and, even if you're only seeing the fragments of it, you can't draw the bigger picture from it. Or, everybody just kind of has their own experience. Like, I have my experience of this interview, you have your experience of this interview. You, the listener who's listening to this right now, have your experience of this interview. Like, we're all interpreting it and interpolating it in different ways, just because of the fact of, you know, we're human beings who each have a different context that we've brought through our lived experience to what it is that we're engaging with.
Yeah, I mean, because it's like the listener, you could be, you know, driving your car right now and something happens and you see it, and that's your experience with that podcast and episode, and now you're tied to it, because that's just, oh, I love that kind of stuff. I think there's an English word called sonder, which I think it means something like when you see a person and try to imagine their life, and it's kind of like that feeling of like, I saw that person at the grocery store, and they're going to get into their car and they're going to drive off and go to their home. And what is that like? And when I was a kid, I used to imagine that kind of stuff all the time, because I would go on these really long car rides. Was this something that kind of like thinking about spaces and thinking about other stories through spaces and the stories that spaces tell, was this something that you've always kind of like played with, like in maybe childhood or high school or college or whatever, or is it something more recent?
Yeah, I think it's certainly, I don't know, I'm thinking back, and like, I feel like it's the kind of thing I don't have, again, I don't have like a very clear through line of like, oh, I, you know, had this moment of, you know, grand existentialist epiphany about, oh, literally everybody else in the world has their own lived experience and is, you know, has a soul. Like, I probably had that epiphany at some point in my life, but I couldn't give you the details, like the date and the time for it, certainly. But I think it's certainly something that I'm continuing to interrogate in my work. I think especially as I'm continuing to design, I'm really interested in, that idea of, you know, you can't, there might be some things that are true about the world or fixed about the world, but no one person is going to have a full objective perspective. Like, there's beauty in kind of the limitations of, you know, I'm only one person, and my perspective is going to be different from the person down the street, the person across from me on the subway. There's just something that's really, I don't know, simultaneously like existential, but also very calming or reassuring to know, okay, nobody here has the big picture. Like, none of us really know what we're doing.
I get that same sense of satisfaction. It's kind of freeing, honestly, because if you think you have the answers, you're kind of like setting yourself up for failure. And those expectations. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's very freeing and calm too. Does the thought of leading a group through the creative landscapes of your imagination terrify you? Do you worry about being asked questions you don't know the answers to? Have you wanted to try being a dungeon or game master, but your social anxiety has been holding you back? Hi, I'm Amber, and I used to nearly vomit at the idea of running a tabletop RPG. How'd I get over that anxiety? I haven't. Surprise! I'm still an anxious mess, and you can listen to all of it on Shapeshift, where I've recorded 80% of every game I've ever ran. Over the last 4 years, I've run a ton of indie one-shots like Casketland, a weird Western horror game, to my first ever campaign using Ryutama, a Studio Ghibli-like exploration-focused game. Follow me through my journey learning how to GM and to live with my anxiety. It doesn't go away completely, but it does get easier to manage. Go to geekspective.com to find out more information or find Shapeshift on wherever you listen to your podcasts. So going back to the last game that you mentioned, which was, I'm sorry, did you say Street Magic? How are you exploring that kind of theme with this game? Is it present in this game as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's probably the most overtly present in I'm sorry, did you say Street Magic? Street Magic is a game it's a city building game. It's a game where you are, as a table taking turns. You're gonna create by the end of it you create a city, but you do it by placing down, like, you can create neighborhoods and be like, okay, here's the neighborhood that I'm interested in creating this round. And then you can you can build landmarks that are built into pre-existing neighborhoods. And you can, also create residents who are people who are, inhabitants of the city associated with landmarks. So it's kind of nested in that way. It's nested and very fractal. No neighborhood that has only one landmark. Like, you're going to create just a bunch of different details about this one city and populate it. But the thing that I guess is kind of most relevant or resonant with this conversation about Street Magic, I would say, is, it is that idea that, this city isn't complete. You're going to put down a couple of neighborhoods and a couple of landmarks within those neighborhoods and a couple of people, but however long you're going to play, like, you could keep playing this game. It's intended to be like for one shots, or you could use it to create a city and then play a different campaign in that setting. It's kind of a setting generation tool in that way. But the idea behind it is like, okay, you could just play this game for an infinitely long amount of time and you'll never have the full city. Like, you're never going to have every single place, because how are you going to define a place? Are you going to say, okay, this coffee shop is its own place? Is the bookstore upstairs part of the same landmark? Is that a completely different landmark? And those could be two separate landmarks, but depending on, for me, those are two different places. For somebody else, oh no, that's just one building. That's just the building that I pass by on the way to work. Like, my experience of those places is completely different from somebody else's experience of those places, is different from somebody else who might not even know that building exists. You might live in this city for decades and have never been on that city block in your entire life. And there's just, the idea of building out a place that is in and of itself kind of intrinsically subjective. Like, I think it's a game that works best when you, the players, acknowledge that, okay, the perspectives that we are putting down about these places and these people who live here are limited.
I am a huge fan of that. I think about this too with food. Not just places, but the food we eat. I've been watching a documentary called Flavorful Origins, and it's about cuisines all across China. And I'm like, there is food I'm never, ever going to get to experience. It exists, but doesn't exist for me. And I can only know about it, kind of, but I'll never know it. And it boggles my mind when I think about it sometimes. So I like this concept. I like world building games too, especially for, like you said, using it as a setting generator tool. Super awesome. So, assuming that you like this and are enjoying your time in this TTRPG hole that you have fallen into, is there plans for you for more games coming? Like, do you have ideas that you're willing to share that you're, like, thinking about in the future?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. What I will say right now is most of the work that I've been doing lately has been collaborations. I've been collaborating with my creative, a friend of mine in the tabletop space who we've taken on something of a creative partnership. Ben Roswell, the two of us are publishing games under Small Planet Games, is kind of what we're labeling ourselves as. So we've been working on a couple of different releases. The big one that we released recently was called Rearguard, which was a third-party supply drop, the Forged in the Dark game Beam Saber. So we've done some third-party stuff, but we're currently in the process of designing a new game to be released. It's called Lowland. The idea is we're pitching it as like the walking simulator of tabletop RPGs. And also, like, what if Mario Party was what if Mario Party was a walking simulator and also a tabletop RPG?
Please, yes. There are so many great Mario Party mini games that would be so good for TTRPG stuff. It would be so fun. Ah, that's exciting. What's it called again?
It's called Lowland.
Lowland. All right.
Yeah.
I'm making a personal note. That's super, super exciting. I didn't know about Small Planet Games. That's cool. When did you guys start doing making games under that?
So we started doing some unofficial collaboration stuff. I would say like early summer of last year, summer of 2020. We were starting to bounce some ideas back and forth. I helped Ben out with a couple of things that he was designing, and then I started designing a couple of things, and he offered me some feedback, and eventually the ideas that we had back and forth were just like, hey, we are picking up the same things that the other is putting down. We might as well try to create something together and see kind of what comes of that. So that was like, I would say, late fall, early winter of 2020. And we didn't formally announce our partnership like publicly until January of this last year. But since then we've still been going pretty strong.
Cool. Is there a Twitter or a place we can find Small Planet Games?
We don't actually have like a Twitter account for our joint things. If you want to find Ben, you can find him at Ben Auden Roswell. That's roswellian.itch.io, or Roswell Writes on Twitter. So you can follow him, you can follow me. The two of us are cooking up some pretty exciting stuff.
I am excited for that, but I that sounds like a good way to end this, but I still have questions for you. So we'll do that again, but I am also gonna pick that other part of what you said you do at the beginning, which is visual artist. So when you say visual artist, what does that encompass for what you do?
Yeah, most of the work that I do these days is just sort of graphic design. Growing up, I was really into visual art. I always was like, oh, I'm gonna make comics. I'm gonna be an animator. I like drawing these cartoons, and it was never something that and it was something that ultimately I found myself, I just couldn't commit to doing like super, super extensively. But in high school, I took a couple of classes on design, and that really kind of sparked some of my thinking of like, oh, graphic design, it's rigorous in a similar way to, traditional illustration, but it uses just a slightly different part of your brain. You're thinking less about the mechanics of form and gesture and thinking a little bit more about things like color theory or shape. I got into graphic design just because I was taking the classes, and I was fortunate that my teacher was like, hey, you should try using Illustrator, Adobe, like getting into vector-based programs instead of Photoshop, which was kind of that sort of online, programs were what I was using for art at the time. And somehow I managed to half learn and half teach myself how to do like vector-based art, and that was kind of interesting. I was like, okay, there's something interesting about thinking about, shapes and layers and the aspects of graphic design that just appealed to my brain a little bit more than, things like figure drawing or gesture work. There's just something about that I don't know. It just kind of clicked for my brain.
Yeah, I feel very much the same. The kind of my graphic design path is very much I like technical stuff, and for me, graphic design is usually first and foremost information design. Yeah, and trying to get information across, right? So my question for you is, as I'm looking at your itch page, did you do most of the visual art and graphic design for your games?
Most of them, yes. Street Magic, and Street Magic's like sibling, like kind of spin-off game. The art for those two was done by a friend of mine, Shannon Cow, who is a really fantastic illustrator. She actually like created this series of like cityscape kind of magical drawings and was posting them as like her own anthology series. And I was like, these are really great, and also like the exact vibe. And like she was really gracious enough just to let me, to give me permission to use the work that she had already created. So that was really just kind of fortuitous. But yeah, for pretty much all of the other games on my itch page, I've either done the illustration myself, or if not the full illustrations, at least the layout. I've steadily been getting back into layout design. I think something you said about, graphic design is about information and flow of information, certainly resonant in the way that I like to think about my work.
Anytime I can talk to people about graphic design or layout or information design, I'm like, yes, please talk to me about it, because I'm very passionate about it, and I'm just looking at some of yours, and I think they are beautiful. Just like even like in I'm Sorry, Did You Say Street Magic, the introducing the game, like the little page call outs. I love good, clean, like easy to read information. Very clear, accessible, good bolding. Good job. I love it. I think it looks really good, and that's very beautiful. And now we can do the whole plugs and all of that. So Caro, if people want to find your stuff online, where could they do so?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and itch.io at cexcursion. It's spelled SEA excursion.
Okay, and then, and that would have all your itch and everything on it as well, right? I think so.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
I do have a Patreon. I don't really use it very much these days. But if you want to chip a couple extra bucks my way, feel free to do that as well.
Yes, please do, and buy some itch games, because they are beautiful and they look fun, and I'm excited, and I am going to do it. I'm gonna buy Squeak Easy because I want to be a rat.
Thank you. We all just want to be a rat? Isn't that just the dream?
I mean, if I could just eat and be happy with a stinky egg, like that's all I need in life, I would be very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. You can find me on Twitter at RocketOrca, Kenny as at Wolfmere, and John is at Crossways GM. Tabletop Babble is part of the Geekspective Network. Go to geekspective.com to check out all our other shows, or follow us on Twitter at Geekspective. Our theme music was provided by the Battle Bards.